My name is Lucy Purdon. I run the ICT program at the Institute for Human Rights and Business. And thanks to CGCS for inviting me here and also for supporting this work as well. It's been really great to work with you guys over the past year and a half, 2 years maybe. So this study we're going to be talking about was just published on Monday, so it's very new. So I'm really looking forward to your reactions and questions about it. So we're going to be looking at the topic of mobile network shutdowns in Pakistan, how telecommunication companies handle requests to shut down the network, and what some of the resulting negative human rights impacts are. So I'll just tell you a little bit about the Institute first. We're a global think and do tank, as my boss likes to describe us, and we work on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. We're a relatively small organisation, but we have staff based in the UK, in DC, Brussels and Geneva, and we also have regional centres in Myanmar, Latin America, in Colombia, and representing East Africa in Kenya. And we've also had a bit of a focus on China recently as well. IHRB co-convened one of the first business and human rights roundtables in China in 2014. And over the next couple of years, some of my colleagues are going to be focusing on engaging with Chinese extractives companies in Myanmar, East Africa and Latin America through those 3 regional centres. So we're kind of branching out into many territories now. But the way we like to describe our work is that it's based around 4 flows, and these 4 flows are what we believe make the world go round. And they are labour, information, commodities, and finance. So our ICT work is concerned with the flow of information, and in particular how ICT companies can impact this flow and the human rights that we associate with the free flow of information, such as freedom of expression and privacy. So our ICT programme began in 2012 when we worked on the European Commission ICT sector guide on implementing the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Does everyone know what the UN GPs are? These are a set of standards that were adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011, which was looking at the government duty to protect human rights, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, and access to remedy. And it's become kind of the authoritative framework that businesses should follow in respecting human rights. So during this research, we interviewed a lot of stakeholders for this guide, and companies were telling us these really interesting dilemmas that they were facing, some very complex challenges and interesting ways that they were tackling them, which they weren't really making public or telling a lot of people that they were doing. So we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could encourage companies and support companies to be open about some of these challenges and document how companies are tackling them. So we wanted to present case studies, in-depth human rights analysis, and policy-orientated recommendations that could serve as best practice examples and signposts for other companies in similar situations, and really raise the bar in terms of transparency and accountability. So we called these challenges digital dangers, and we came up with this quite ambitious methodology. We would choose a particular company facing a particular challenge in a particular country and embed one of our researchers into the company for a short period of time, with their permission, of course, to observe the situation unfold in real time on the ground. And the company that was the subject of the case study, they were able to review our report, but only to identify any proprietary information. All of the recommendations and conclusions were ours, and we didn't seek or accept any funding from companies for this work because we believe their value lies in their independence and impartiality. So these were the 3 case studies that we've ended up producing in this first phase of the project. So we looked at the issue of hate speech. I came here a couple of years ago and presented this case study. It's nice to see a couple of familiar faces. Repeat business, it's great. So we looked at the issue of hate speech in elections, the misuse of telecommunications systems, which was around the time of Snowden, which was looking at lawful interception and surveillance, and also the most recent study on network shutdowns. So this is kind of a snapshot of the wide range of challenges that ICT companies globally are facing regarding respecting freedom of expression and privacy, and that they very quickly have to become experts in these situations as they unfold on the ground. So why focus on network shutdowns for this last one? So while we no longer see countrywide mobile and internet shutdowns on the scale of Egypt during the Arab Spring, spring in 2011. That's a very rare occurrence. It does occasionally happen, but it's very, very rare. But we do see that some governments are reaching for the off switch for communications in times of civil unrest or for national security reasons, which is now affecting certain areas and certain services. So mobile communications, internet, or certain services like Twitter, Facebook, or WhatsApp. So, for example, WhatsApp was recently shut down in the Gujarat region of India, and that potentially impacted 60 million people. So even though these shutdowns are supposed to be very targeted, it can still impact millions of people. And most national laws do allow for governments to take control of communications during a national emergency, but the situations in which governments can exercise this power are often very vague. The request process to telecommunications companies to actually physically shut down the network is unclear, it's technically complex, and there's virtually no transparency around this at all. And in addition, it's still a very difficult topic for telecommunications companies to talk about because of this national security element. So those are the kind of issues that we're going to be looking at today. So these are a few examples of shutdowns that have happened in the past 5 years. This is not a comprehensive list, but it just gives you a flavour of some of the reasons why governments want to shut down communications. So in China in 2010, there were riots in the Xinjiang province between ethnic groups, which led to the internet being shut down for 10 months. In the USA, in San Francisco, the public transport system, the BART, they shut down communications in the stations to prevent protests from taking place after a man was shot by transport police. And in India, in 2014, the government shut down parts of the internet in Kashmir, which was reportedly to prevent Kashmir leaders from addressing a Human Rights Council side event in Geneva via video link. And Turkey, which you probably all know, they've blocked Twitter many times over the past few years. In DRC, these are the two really interesting recent ones. The Democratic Republic of Congo, this was a near countrywide shutdown that happened during just after the elections, I think, or no, the president had decided to run for a third term, which was unconstitutional, and there was a lot of protests around this, so the communications were shut down. And also, similar thing happened in May in Burundi, similar protests over the president's plan to run for election again. And the social networking sites were shut down here. So those are some examples of the wide range of reasons that governments want to shut down communications and the services affected. But today we are going to be looking at that very blunt instrument of mobile network shutdowns. So why focus on Pakistan? Well, the reason we wanted to focus on Pakistan is because mobile shutdowns are still relatively frequent. They often happen around religious or national holidays. They can be quite predictable year on year. They seem to have happened around the same time, and also around other protests and marches that might have happened for various reasons. And they're mostly justified under national security reasons. It's supposedly that from the government side, they say that shutting down networks prevents terrorists from communicating, but also prevents terrorists from detonating bombs via mobile phones. So very, very serious situation. And we were interested in finding out how the telecommunications operators dealt with these very sensitive situations. So we developed this research project. These were our initial research questions. And posing, they seem, they're quite simple questions, but posing these at the start of the process really demonstrated how little information there was on this topic in the public domain regarding shutdowns, and really thought that there was this need to, do some more research and start a discussion about this very untransparent process. So also the challenge for the companies, there's a real dilemma for the companies because of the national security element. How are operators supposed to push back on these requests? So in the human rights and business world, companies are encouraged that any request they get from governments, they try to narrow it as much as possible. They try to respect human rights in the range of human rights in all situations. But when government asks a company to shut down communications because there's an imminent threat a bomb is going to go off, how are companies supposed to push back on that? What processes should they put in place? And also in the human rights world, when we talk about network shutdowns, it's mostly always framed as a freedom of expression issue, that shutting down networks impacts freedom of expression. But that's very difficult to argue solely against when there's national security elements. So we wanted to look at other impacts as well. What were the economic impacts? What are the impacts on health, education, and work? We really wanted to broaden this debate outside of freedom of expression. So one of our researchers was embedded into the telecommunications operator Telenor Pakistan to observe how they dealt with these shutdown requests. This was an incredible thing that Telenor Pakistan agreed for us to do because of, this has not been done before as far as I'm aware. So during this embedding period, we learned all about how the requests for shutdowns are submitted to operators, how they're executed, and how Telenor Pakistan had been in discussions with the government over a number of years to narrow the requests. And we were able to produce this process in detail, which is in the study that there's copies available. So it was really interesting to learn that prior to 2009, there was no process at all. So shutdowns had been happening in Pakistan from around 2005, mostly in the Balochistan region. And at that point, it was anyone from the government or any law enforcement agency could call up and ask for this to be shut down, and there was no process. So Telenor Pakistan tried to encourage the regulator to make sure that there was a proper request process put in place. So now there is this more streamlined process. There is a number of law enforcement agencies now who are authorised to make requests, but that is actually confidential. We don't know which law enforcement agencies they are. And the request has to be put in writing, and it goes to the PTA, which is the regulator, the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority. And then the PTA verifies that it's okay, that the person's authorised to make this request, and then they pass it on to Telenor Pakistan and the other operators as well. There are other operators there operating in Pakistan, obviously. And this request should not be open-ended. It needs to specify the geographical area, the times it's going to take places, and the duration, because apparently what was happening before was just these requests were coming in to shut down communications, and there was no end point. So they say now that these shutdowns are more surgical, they're more targeted, they're not blanket shutdowns like they used to be, but there is still this problem of spillover, which I learned about. So when an area is shut down, in order to stop people just outside the shutdown area from communicating, they will actually widen it. So it's a bigger area than the threatened, the place where there is a threat to security. So what it ends up with happening is that there are areas that, whereas there is no threat to security, will have their communications impacted. So really the best way to illustrate this is by looking at one particular shutdown that happened on March 23rd this year, which is Pakistan Day. It's a national holiday. It's usually celebrated with a big military parade, as you can see, but this had been put on hold for a number of years because of security threats. So this was the first time in about 7 years that this parade had taken place. And Telenor Pakistan received an order. We didn't know about this. This was going to happen, by the way. This is all kind of after the fact that we found this out. Well, we kind of knew a shutdown was going to happen, but Telenor Pakistan didn't tell us that it was going to happen. So Telenor Pakistan received a request to shut down communications within a 5-kilometre radius of the parade site for 11 days. And this is this is just for illustration. It's not a completely accurate map, but the parade site was here. You have a major hospital here, and the airport is kind of just in the spillover area here. And this is quite a densely populated area as well. So what Telenor Pakistan did was, say 11 days is crazy. This is a crazy amount of time. And they opened a dialogue with the government, and they managed to reduce the length of the shutdown to 2 8-hour periods on the 22nd and the 23rd of March. So that's kind of a really good example of how opening a dialogue with the government is possible. And, they did manage to reduce the shutdown quite considerably. But as I mentioned, one of the aims of the project was to look at the impacts on people during shutdowns. So we partnered with two other organisations, the Bytes for All, who are an Islamabad-based digital rights organisation, and the Centre for Internet and Human Rights in Berlin. And we developed a questionnaire which was designed to investigate how people felt about shutdowns and also how they impacted issues such as health, education and work. So, as I say, we didn't have advance notice of this shutdown, but we could identify this pattern because it had taken place at the same day for a number of years previously. So once it became clear that the shutdown was happening, the researchers from Bytes for All went out into the street and conducted these questionnaires, and we collected around 190. Now, it was a varying success of data that we got back, and it certainly wasn't a fully comprehensive picture. But what it did give us was clues and pointers that served as a catalyst for further research. And by analysing this shutdown as it unfolded, we were able to highlight a number of these different impacts, such as the fact that emergency services can't be accessed during a shutdown via mobile phone. Also, mobile money transactions can't take place, which is huge in Pakistan, and also a big thing people felt was that they couldn't communicate with their family and their friends to ensure people they were safe, and that was a big deal to a lot of people. So those were some of the impacts that we touched upon that we think it warrants more research and more in-depth investigation. Also, the economic impacts. The company loses a lot of money. Therefore, there is a loss of tax revenue to the government. But there hasn't been a full study on the economic impacts of shutdowns, as far as I'm aware. I think during Egypt, the OECD did a very short study and said it was something like $90 million a day, but it was not really. It was very hard to know what it was based on. So I think what's missing out of this debate is a very good study on economic impacts.
Back to this question of norms.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting things to me is whether the architecture allows for shutdowns. That is to say, the insistence by countries that the system permit shutdowns. So before you get to this question of request or orders,
the
issue is whether there's a capacity to make these kinds of decisions, have these kinds of impacts. When you were looking at the norm, did you look at that question, which is to what extent is there kind of systematic across the board insistence on the capacity to shut down the system?
Right. Okay. Technically, I don't think we touched on that, but it's in the law. So it's in a lot of the country's laws that governments can take control or shut down communications. It's kind of the same with the surveillance, aspect that. It's like the surveillance question that in a lot of countries' national laws, telecommunications officers will have to, install. They'll have to be the capability that governments can get hold of data or request data.
Request or an order? When you say request, do you mean an order or do you mean request? Request meaning they have to implement it.
Yeah, I mean, Telenor Pakistan are pushing back on the orders, but they've never refused one. They've also actually challenged this law as well. So, I mean, at the moment, you could say it is a request, but to defy it would have very serious consequences.
What's their market share? I mean, what other providers are there, and then are those people also, they push back on from 11 days down to 2 8-hour periods, but are other providers just saying, okay, 11 days?
Yeah. So their market share, it's in here, sorry, I don't know off the top of my head. They are not the biggest, they're the second largest. The largest one is Mobilink. And Telenor Pakistan seem to be the most vocal. They're the only ones that have filed legal challenges. But I think there is some conversation going on behind the scenes. I think there is, one of our recommendations is also that there should be more of an industry-wide effort, right? One company can't solve this alone. So I haven't seen the other operators being so vocal about it. But all the operators will get the same request. Okay, so yes, so this kind of answers your question a little bit about it. It is in the law, in their telecommunications law, that they can take control of the system, which is interpreted as shutting it down or asking the operators to shut it down.
Were there proclamations of emergency, or was this independent of the proclamation of emergency?
Right. So this law does, the clause before this one, 54.2, does talk about a state of emergency. And this is why Telenor Pakistan has challenged it, because they say the use of this section for shutdowns can only be invoked if it's a state of emergency. And they believe that in the absence of a state of emergency, the provision doesn't apply, and therefore network shutdowns are orders without any legal basis. This is still pending, but also civilians have started filing writ petitions as well to challenge network shutdowns because of the impacts on their lives. So, for example, around the same time Telenor Pakistan submitted a writ, there was one filed by a doctor who, on the basis that shutdowns prevented her from communicating with her patients. And this was provoked because during one of the shutdowns, one of this doctor's, she was a gynecologist, the patient was pregnant, and this patient was trying to contact the doctor. She couldn't, and the patient lost her baby. So this was the impetus for this doctor to file a complaint about it. So there are questions and pushbacks, but like I say, Telenor Pakistan hasn't refused. They've narrowed, and they've they're challenging, but they haven't refused ever to shut it down.
Telenor and Mobilink, both Pakistani companies entirely?
So Telenor Pakistan is a subsidiary of Telenor Group, which is based in Norway. And Mobilink, let me get this right, I can't quite remember, but Mobilink, I think Telenor have a share in Mobilink, and also Wimpelcom, which is a Netherlands, Dutch company as well. So I think Telenor Pakistan it's a local subsidiary of a much larger group. Okay, so this is what the UN has to say about shutdowns in general. So these are communications from a group of special rapporteurs on freedom of expression from the UN, the OSCE, the OAS, and the African Commission. So they got together and they issued this first joint declaration about how cutting off access to the internet is never justified under human rights law, even on national security grounds, which also applies to slowdowns or throttling. So that's quite a that's a pretty clear statement. And then the second one is the same group of special rapporteurs, and this is a joint declaration on freedom of expression and response to conflict. So this is just in conflict situations. And so they say that using the kill switches and shutting down entire parts of communication systems can never be justified. But the gap here is that, so this covers internet shutdowns and communication shutdowns during conflict, but it leaves this gap as to about when mobile shutdowns can be evoked in other situations. So while there is some writing about this at an international level, there is kind of a lot of things that are falling through the gaps at the moment.
Means never. You think never means never in this context? And how does this relate to your work on Kenya? Was there some sort of shutdown in Kenya? The election?
No, they didn't shut it down, which was interesting. They didn't actually shut it down. Well, they did in 2007. They shut down the media. There was a media blackout, which the post-election inquiries thought contributed to the violence because there was no information getting out. But in 2013 elections, they didn't shut it down. What was your other question?
So let's say I don't know about the ownership of the company, but let's say there's it's a publicly owned company and there are foreign investors in it,
right?
Foreign owners. And so how would you in your research? How would you classify, for instance, a government invocation of sovereignty over digital content? The there were controversies, for instance, about BlackBerry in the past, where
Mhm.
India said, look, this is a matter of sovereignty.
Yeah.
Because if any of the data is stored in servers outside of our territory, then that kicks in. So
Yeah.
how would you define that in terms of is it a request? Is it an order? Is it a disconnect? There is no kill switch to use in that case. But how would you where do such incidents fit in this kind of research? Is what I'm
Yeah.
curious about.
Well, Pakistan has actually, I can't remember what it's actually called, whether it's what the order is called, but they want to ban BlackBerry Messenger. They also want to ban WhatsApp and Skype. Now, what banning means, again, how is that? Is that just kind of making a bit of noise about it? What is the proposal going to look like? How is that technically going to be executed? These are all very, very good questions. It's a really complicated area, but it starts with, the government saying, we don't want this in our country, so we're going to ban it. David Cameron said the same in the UK about banning encryption, in general. It's kind of a very vague statement.
So it's more of a rhetorical assertion of what they think they can say for political consumption rather than the actual ability to cut any flows.
Possibly,
for real.
yeah.
Okay.
Possibly. Yeah. Hey.
What is happening technically when they're cutting things off? Like, what are they physically shutting down?
So in the mobile network shutdown, it's the towers. So that's why they kind of, it's not that perfect circle that I showed you of that radius, because they're just shutting down particular towers that are talking to each other, and that's why they get this spillover as well. In terms of the internet, I and the other services, I don't know, I haven't got to those ones yet, because this was just about mobile ones. But yeah, that's a case of
I'm not sure it's rhetorical. I mean, I think companies comply, the other question is, when you have in this language here cutting access to the internet or parts of the internet, the parts of the internet here mean parts of the mechanical, that's say population, or parts as in apps and things like that?
It's a good question. Access to the internet or parts of the internet. I read that as being the internet being countrywide, and then I read it as being geographical rather than, because you had Egypt, which was almost countrywide, and now that doesn't happen so much, but it's much more targeted. There are parts of the internet that it shuts down.
What is the effectiveness of this statement? What does the UN say? This is not it's not. Is it binding on states? Or is it a?
No, it's just a general comment, I think. So no, it's not binding, but this is what I mean about there being such a lack of information and kind of research out there, because this is it. This is the extent of the communications at an international level, or it is kind of vague, and it's in very.
I think the problem is it's not vague. It says never, in a context in which never is probably not an operative term.
Which is why it's rhetorical.
Yeah.
Right. Just a follow-up to Reviti's question. I was going to say your Digital Dangers logo, it looks like a sawed-off transoceanic cable.
It does.
There was a cartoon a while ago about two kind of lumberjack-looking guys in the water sawing off one of these cables. So.
All right. Okay.
I didn't think about it, but.
Okay. So I was going to bring this back kind of full circle to look at Egypt again, and how after their shutdown, they looked at their telecommunication law. Now, Egypt's not a best practice example, but part of this study was looking at other countries and where there's been perhaps there's change in the law, or perhaps some pressure from civil society or business that's improved the situation. And Egypt is interesting because this was the original law that justified the shutdown in 2011. So it's Article 67 of their Telecommunications law, and it's again it's just a general statement about how the government can take control of the networks in cases of environmental disaster, and during periods of declared general mobilization concerning national security. So it's quite vague. And after the Arab Spring, amendments to this law were drafted and proposed, and they were put into Egypt's ICT strategy from 2012 to 2017, which is a document which is still on the internet, but it's no one has ever looked at this. They weren't implemented because obviously what happened following the events in Egypt in 2013. But I just think that the comparison is quite useful. So this is the amended text. So it prohibits shutdowns entirely, except on a written decision by the president rather than this an unspecified competent authorities in the last one. So following approval by the cabinet, and then after any disconnection, a written report has to be submitted to the People's Assembly explaining this decision. So it's kind of adding a little bit of transparency. But it's not stated what should be in this report, or specify any, that the request should specify the length of the shutdown, the geographical area, etc. And also it says that disruption of emergency services are not permitted, but it doesn't specify what measures should be taken to rectify that. So I just think it's kind of an interesting comparison that this was on the table, but it never went through. So it's kind of possible that there could be some more specificity in the laws. So putting all of this together, we were able to develop some short-term recommendations and of some key characteristics that we think should be included in legislation. So this is ways to increase transparency and oversight and ensuring that emergency services stay on. So this is kind of just putting together everything that we'd learned throughout the experience of Pakistan, and also looking at other countries like Egypt. We also looked at Kazakhstan and Ireland as well. There were some quite interesting examples of what people had done there. And we think this is quite a reasonable list of things. Also, in terms of the companies, recommendations to companies, there should be continued access to emergency services during shutdowns. We think that's a huge problem. And, Pakistan has proved that opening a dialogue with the government can have some positive results. And if Pakistan can do it, then other countries can do it. Like you said about one company not being able to, make a change, then there should be some collective action around this. There are, industry groups like the Telecommunications Industry Dialogue, which is currently housed under the Global Network Initiative, that provides space for companies to talk about this. We don't see a reason why companies can't include records of shutdown requests in their transparency reporting. So a lot of ICT companies produce transparency reports which lists the number of requests they get from governments for access to user data. So we would think, well, why can't you include requests, from network shutdowns? That's something that we would like to follow up with after this.
Worried about this as a legitimating document, that this legitimates shutdowns. Yeah.
I mean, these are short because that's why I present them as short term, because in the longer term, obviously, as a human rights advocate, you want to reduce them, and you want the government to find alternatives to this. We don't think that shutting down a network is the solution to stopping terrorism. But in the meantime, I mean, they're not going to stop it anytime soon. So in the meantime, is there other things that can be put in place that can increase accountability, transparency, lessen the impacts, while working towards a longer term goal of reducing the frequency and maybe stopping it? Yeah.
So is my impression correct that you seem to treat companies as neutral actors that sort of interact? They're like subjected to government requests or pressure. Yeah, they care about civil society and all that stuff. But we have many examples where companies have been autonomous political actors, right? So take the example of Egypt, since you mentioned it, when the government tried to shut down the internet Google helped create all kinds of circumvention software
Yeah.
through servers in Tunisia, in Libya, all that stuff. Facebook, at the same time that, for instance, there was the big call for the uprising in Egypt.
Yeah.
There's some evidence that Facebook actually poured some resources into that site because it had 1 million followers. There was a similar call on a similar Facebook page to have an uprising in the West Bank that Facebook shut down, right? So they're not neutral. They're not neutral players. They are themselves political actors. How would that, if you were to take account of that, would it change your overall conclusions or not?
So we're looking at it from a human rights perspective and the processes and policies that are in place and how that matches up to something like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. I mean, sure, in terms of content, when you're talking about shutting, the Facebook examples, the Twitter examples, I mean, is Facebook a political actor? I don't know.
What would be interesting to know is how they make these decisions.
Oh, right, sure, yeah.
So there were Tunisian
Absolutely,
activists, for
yeah.
instance.
Which is why these processes need to be more transparent, because a lot of it, we don't know how a lot of them make the decisions. So in terms of, Facebook shutting down a particular page, there is a concern that's, if it's like an anti-government page, then pro-government people are constantly complaining about it and reporting it. And because this volume of reporting, Facebook goes, oh, it must be terrible, we'll take it down. Whereas that's not the case. So, Facebook say that that's not what happens, but because that process wasn't there was no transparency around it, people didn't know how they were making this decision. So we would advocate for the decision-making process being very, very open.
And I mean, another part of the problem, they had no ways of assessing who actually the players on the ground were. So if the government lodges more complaints in Tunisia, for instance, with YouTube, if they lodge more complaints than activists, that you should shut down these, you should disconnect links to these videos. They had no idea to know what the videos were about. Right. So if you respond to a government positively without knowing what you're doing, it's a problem. They didn't want to spend the money or the resources, the human resources primarily, to have people who actually can evaluate what they might be shutting down or not. I mean, I'm just thinking of this as a huge area
it's huge. And this is obviously a bit more local than Facebook. But if you think about at the beginning,
on this, whether it's the premise of the Institute for Human Rights in Business that businesses are autonomous actors. In other words, the whole notion of the whole foundation of the human rights in business is that businesses have some autonomy and have some responsibility. And I'm not sure where they go with that, but I would say in general that's got to be their premise. And they're supposed to develop policies of some sort that maybe maintain neutrality. I'm not sure.
What was the level of access that the embedded researcher had in the hierarchy of Telenor?
So they had access to, they were at the headquarters. In terms of like sitting in the room where they actually flick the switch, no.
In terms of making decisions on how to push back to the government, what the process and negotiating strategy is going to be, that kind of access.
Yeah. So we weren't in the office while the March the 23rd one unfolded. We saw that retrospectively, but they were in the office talking to the people who make the decisions, the legal department, policy, the chain of command of how the requests are made.
Hi. I have a piggyback on this question about corporations being neutral actors, or the mobile companies. So I work on ICTs in Kenya.
Okay.
And in Kenya, the relationship between government actors, the state, and mobile corporations is extremely intimately connected. The government owns part of Safaricom and has historically owned large shares of it. And there are certain government actors that have social relationship, business relationships with people who are part of Safaricom, right? Mm-hmm. And other mobile companies too. So I'm curious if you're analytically separating the state versus the mobile corporations, how does that play into what sorts of recommendations become possible or not possible when you're thinking about it from a human rights perspective?
So so going with the UN Guiding Principles are three separate pillars. So it's the government duty to protect human rights, and then it's the corporate responsibility to respect. So we're looking at the corporate responsibility, like what should they be putting in place. Now, so the guiding principles say that companies need to respect human rights across all of their operations. They're very clear about this. When a company is state-owned, or majority state run, then that becomes that's where the confusion lies, and there are a lot of questions around what else is at stake. But that's still the corporate responsibility is still the same. There's still this process that they should be putting in place, human rights impact assessments, reporting. So this is what I'm kind of focusing on, is this process and policy area of it.
Basically a normative structure for understanding what's happening,
It's
as opposed to
coming
at it from on the ground. What are these relationships?
Do you mean this or the guiding principles in general?
If there are these relationships that exist, then if you're producing recommendations based on a normative as opposed to actual situation, then what do you do with that?
Right. So we make recommendations to governments as well on their duty. So we do kind of separate it out in that respect, I guess. But I know what you mean. A recommendation like saying you need to respect freedom of expression in all situations is not very helpful. So we do try to make them quite concrete, and starting off with the stuff about emergency services staying on, I'm sure that there's some kind of way that can happen, and that's a huge impact on people. But you want to be ambitious as well. So it's kind of so realistic and practical recommendations, which I think that it's I think they're all right. They're pretty good. But also, governments do have responsibilities to respect human rights. Pakistan has signed up to all of these international instruments. It's worth reminding them, that even though it might not take any notice, but they do exist.
Just a practical, mechanical thing. What is the role exactly of the Pakistani Telecommunications Authority in this? Because they're overseen by the government, I would imagine. Mm-hmm. And are they processing? Are they evaluating and approving these? And then an attendant question, how urgent are these requests on average? Is it like you have to comply within 6? Because I imagine if it's a national security threat, it's got to happen fairly quickly.
It depends. So with the notice period, there is no standard one. It varies apparently. And with the regulator, as far as I understand, because there was this pre-2009, there was no system in place. So it was anyone from any government agency or any law enforcement could ring up the operator and just say, shut this down. So the operators had no, that was just a very awful situation. So the way that the regulator got involved was that all the requests, so it was specified which law enforcement agencies are allowed to do this. They only go to the operator, the regulator. The regulator verifies that person is from that law enforcement agency and passes it on to the operator. As far as I'm aware, that's their exclusive role in this. Yes.
I'm curious if you looked at all on the effects of the shutdowns on more traditional forms of media. So I know in the Kenyan case, for example, when the government shut down, the TV, radio stations, and all of that in 2007, that was the birth of the digital technology sector there, right? That precipitated this huge shift.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, looking at it the other way, have you seen any effects either economically or in terms of content or use on television, radio, etc., during these moments or after?
There's a lot, which I'm not going to say because it's being videoed. Maybe we can talk about it later. Yeah. Okay. Opportunities to engage civil society. So we, in the UN Guiding Principles, there's this whole thing on stakeholder engagement, and that companies should involve the views of local stakeholders, of civil society. And companies do this. They're not very strong on this in general. So we thought this kind of area seemed to be something where the company and civil society groups are aligned in their aims. So the company doesn't want shutdowns to continue, neither does civil society. There seems to be somewhere where there could be some alignment of views. It's not like an oil pipeline running through someone's land. So we thought this...
Society. Not all civil society may be aligned. You may have a plurality of views in terms of supporting attitudes of the government and religious groups and things like that. So it's been a kind of assumption that civil society are good guys, liberal, they support all these principles, etc.
Yeah. So what I was going to say is, this was a recommendation, but I'm not quite sure if it's the right one. So yes, I think it was quite a sort of simplistic. And then as this kind of went on, I'm not sure that that was quite the right way to pose it. But so yes, I kind of agree with you. And also we thought that companies should put in place a consumer grievance mechanisms over network shutdowns. There needs to be some kind of, just to, again, to increase the transparency around this issue and about the impacts. I think that's it. That's it. Thank you.